No, what I really want to do is give our gathering here a chance just to know you personally a little bit. So just a little bit about your family and your ministry setting. And Mac, let's begin with you.
Sure. I'm 68, and so I've done a lot of stuff. It's a dangerous thing to ask me that question because I've done so much. So I graduated from the University of Kentucky with a degree in microbiology, planning on going to medical school, and the Lord rudely interrupted my plans. Actually, it was at an Urbana conference where Billy Graham gave the charge to go into missions, and I stood up. I was engaged to Leanne at the time. She did not stand up. But she looked at Billy and she looked at me and she said, Lord, if it's clear, I'll never say no to you. And so we went into student ministry right out of school. I didn't go to medical school. I'm so glad. And was involved in campus ministry for 25 years. And over that time, directed short-term mission programs. Back when people didn't do short-term mission programs, they were intensive immersion short-terms. They were wonderful. We were in Africa. We were in Tunisia, in North Africa, where we developed an understanding of Arab Muslim world. And then an intensive in Guatemala, in the highlands of Guatemala, with Native American people in Ashil country. It was the site of the Guatemalan Civil War. We took students into the war zone. Their parents didn't know we were taking them into a war zone. I've never told anyone. This is the first time I've acknowledged it publicly. And
we're going to cut that from the tape.
So, yeah, and then in 1999 was asked to pioneer student ministry on Muslim campuses in the Arabian Peninsula. It's not told particularly where. We picked the place. Nobody had heard of Dubai at the time. We went there, and we labored hard. It was a hard start, but by God's grace, we saw a great flourishing of a movement all across the UAE on campuses, and sort of as a result, backed into church planting. As a result, realizing that we're graduating students have come to faith, but the churches here are not in very good shape. So that we went to Iraq in 2016. I pastored a church there for 4 years, and then we came home 2020, right in time for COVID, which felt a lot like Iraq. Actually, it wasn't all that different. Dystopian, nothing on the grocery shelf, stuff like that. So, and so joined Third Avenue Baptist Church. I'm married to one wife. I have 3 boys, all grown children. Our middle son is autistic. He's lived with us and all this time still lives with us. He will till we're gone. And then his brothers will take care of him. I have 7 grandchildren who are a great delight. And we're all members. Well, the grandchildren are little pagans, but all the adults are in the same church, Third Avenue Baptist Church. And so every week, we never saw this coming, but every week we're all together as a family.
Wonderful. Thank you. Phil.
Yeah, so in 2021, my wife and I moved from Africa to Texas, which as somebody who was born in Texas, I always called myself a Texan. I always thought that I was a Texan until I actually moved to Texas and found out that I'm not actually very Texan after all. And that's not good or bad. That's just a fact of life. But that was the 17th move in just under 24 years of marriage. And so I could go through all 17 of those moves, but I don't think we have the time for that. So married to my wife, Laura, since 1997. We have 2 boys, Daniel and Jonathan, who are 21 and 17. And as of now, I am a pastor of a church called Hope Church in Central Texas that we just planted last year. Before that, served in Sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia. Did 2 degrees here at Southern.
Thank you. Nathan.
Nathan Shank, my wife Carrie, and I are just on stateside with the International Mission Board this fall. I married into Oklahoma. Puts my 4 kids and wife just outside of Tulsa right now. Been with the International Mission Board since college. A brief stint in North Carolina, attending seminary. My wife and I met on the field. We've been married 21 years. Those 4 kids, I'm experiencing driver's ed anxiety. While we're here this week, my daughter starting driver's ed in Oklahoma, even a little older than 16, and yet catching up, she was upset that every other kid in driver's ed was 15 and a half, it seems. Nevertheless, work in South Asia, what we've known as far as overseas effort and work has been about primarily a focus on Hindus, but of course stewardship there with Islam, Buddhism as well. Colleagues, a learning community we try to facilitate, we call South Asian peoples with the International Mission Board.
Thank you. All right, Chris.
My name's Chris, obviously. Married to Rebecca 24 years this year, and we've been overseas in Southeast Asia for 22 years. We arrived on the field with a 6-month-old, and in the years past, we've added 4 to that number. So 3 of them are back in the U.S. now, in college or out of college, and we still have 2 with us back home. We've served in 2 different contexts in Southeast Asia. One was a predominantly Buddhist country, and one is a majority Muslim country. The first country, we suffered in language learning, and in our new country, we became proficient in the heart language of our target people overnight. It was incredible. It's English.
Nice. My wife and I have lived overseas for the past 19 years. We've been married for 20. We are small town kids from Missouri. We both grew up on cattle ranches. We were a BSU romance. Or for those of you out there who don't know what that means, that's the Baptist Student Union. That's what we called it back then. That's where we met. And the Lord was guiding us to go overseas, and that's where we went to spend a couple years at Southeastern. And we did the 2+3 program with Nathan and Carrie at the time and launched out together in 2005. So we've been on the field, small town kids, like I said. We live in a small city of 25 million now. And I grew up a half mile away from my nearest neighbor, and I could spit on about 10,000 people where we live now in our city, which I would, of course, never do. But we lead the city work for the IMB in the city that we're in. And we also help oversee and steward the city's conversation for how do we reach mega cities throughout South Asia. And so I coordinate with other city leaders as they're going about their work, and we're trying to raise up city-focused teams all throughout South Asia.
All right. I just want to see, is there a question out here in the audience? I've got a short list in case you don't have questions, but there you go.
Good morning. Just to start my question, I want to say all this discussion is very new to me, so bear with me. This might be a little beginner's question, but I just wanted to understand the context behind the discussion. What is the enemy we're fighting after when we say? Look, I took a note here. Give me just a second. We're fighting up like the paternalistic or colonialistic. So what are we fighting against when we say that? And then just thinking of the model of healthy leadership development that I see back in Brazil, where I'm from, and here in the States, of just long-term discipleship in the local church, pastors for 5-10 years training leaders to be sent out, and at least I would describe it as running together, holding the baton for a long time before passing the baton. So I think my question is, why would that? What's the difference when you're in the mission field, and why? What is the danger with paternalistic view, which maybe wouldn't be a danger if we're talking about doing that here or back in Brazil? And what are the dangers of not doing that? And what I mean by that is, here we would say if we take too short, it could be dangerous. Like if we're training for 1-2 years and sending someone to pastor another church, it could be dangerous because we need time to assess and train. So yeah, I guess. Let
me see if I can help us out here. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to take a poll, and then you'll respond according to how you vote in the poll. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to set this up as those, don't vote yet, put your hand down. Man, you've been in trouble all morning. Those in favor of a plant to pastor So I think you all get the gist there. In favor of that, I'm going to want you to admit who you are. Those who are in favor of a plant and never pastor that church, if I can. We understand that there's some, you might feel compelled in some situation. So, should I make you close your eyes when you vote, or no? Just so I see raise hands if you're on the I prefer the plant to pastor side. First, let's have those. Okay, hands down. And I presume that the rest of you, is anyone going to abstain?
I'd like to vote twice. I'm actually
Put your hand
for
down,
both.
Nathan. Gee whiz. No, I love it. Okay, and then so the rest of you, are you going to abstain, or would you take the don't ever pastor if you can avoid it? Is that where you are?
Yeah, leaning that way in terms of prefer not to. But
Okay.
so again, I would somewhat want to abstain and go back to Chris's point earlier in terms of letting the context
Okay, then
really
help me out.
determine a lot
help
of
me
that.
out, Phil. I want you to give me just a couple of advantages of the plant to pastor.
Well, the advantages presumably would be that the person that is pastoring the plant would come with experience, would come with education, would come with some of the intangibles that would be required to help start a church. That would be some of the advantages, would just be the experience and, again, education, knowledge of having planted before, of having been around a plant before, all of those things.
Nathan, would you add any advantages of that?
Yeah, I think that the major distinction that would cause me to vote twice would be who is the planter, who is the target. My father's been in a plant to pastor model much of my life. I assume he's going to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. My father has primarily targeted his own cultural setting, those peoples that are at least near culture. The question about cross-cultural workers is where I would prefer to make a distinction, preferring the plant but not assume, even as we heard from Dr. Abner, if it's necessary or even amening, that we have very intentional sequence and plans, even perhaps pragmatically employ elder cohorts in order to make sure that that transition takes place, that we do not perpetuate the pastor or take the pastoral role with an open-ended. As a cross-culture worker, we intend to raise up indigenous workers who take and own that aspect of the missionary task as well.
All right, thank you. Now, our two doctors over here, Dr. Snodgrass and Dr. Abner, you all in your presentations and just in your presentations, you were speaking that you'd prefer not to pastor in those churches that you plant in an intercultural setting, a host culture setting. So, tell me, what are some of the advantages of not pastoring?
Well, I think maybe one thing to clarify is that we naturally assume, I think even on the basis of the question, we assume that the best thing for their growth and their eventual maturity is a long time with us. And I just think biblically, we really can't make a positive case for that. That a lot of times the best thing that we can do for discipleship or leadership is to remove our presence. That is risky. Definitely risky. I mean, each of the church planters in the New Testament were taking a risk when they left that place where they had been ministering. And that's why that entrusting, committing, commending to, and I think it also informs the way that we work and how we work while we are there. The pattern of what was normal for church life and for leadership development for a Paul that he could refer back to in Ephesians 20, day and night, I was ministering among you in public and from house to house. That pattern was laying the foundation that allowed him to leave when he did. And so I think that we can naturally assume the longer I'm with this person, the longer this person is with us, the better it is for them. And honestly, I think that sometimes we're delaying, that we're giving leaders a prolonged adolescence by just assuming that them being with us is going to be the best thing for them when they need to be pushed out of the nest a little bit.
Chris, would you add anything to that?
Once again, context is going to drive the answer to a lot of these questions. In our context, if the church that we planted, if we weren't as actively involved in it as we were, the people who would have been on our church planting team would have simply gone to another unhealthy church in the city and gone through the motions of just what they assume Christianity is about.
Can I go ahead? I'll add one more nuance to the idea of context in different settings. So again, where we lived in sub-Saharan Africa, another piece, you said like if you refuse to step into that leadership position just because of credentialing and respect for institutional learning and all of the rest, it would just seem weird to them, and it would seem
weird and almost as though what's the point?
Right, and even and maybe even offensive or something, that you're disrespectful or something like that.
Well, not even disrespectful, but if I have these credentials and I've done all this work and I'm not a part of this team, then why are we even trying to do something?
Got it.
Yeah.
So where we were, I would say nature abhors a vacuum, and so if there were times where if we refused to step into leadership roles, somebody was.
That's right.
And I shouldn't say most often. Some of the times, often, that was going to be someone from an unhealthy church background, and in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, often a prosperity gospel background. And so when we said, and trying to be humble, saying, I'm not going to sit in that seat, then they would say, fine, we'll find somebody else to sit in that seat, and it would end up with a lack of health in the long term for that.
So in that
Which
context,
is why
we wouldn't call either of those settings a 0 to 1 then per se.
debate.
Because
No,
of
correct.
existing harvest force around, even anemia in the existing church.
Yeah, so to be clear, my context for 10 years in sub-Saharan Africa is what we would call legacy areas. So I was intentionally, and I'll talk about this later in my talk, but we intentionally moved to places to try to send out Africans to go to unreached peoples and places. So we had a heart for unreached peoples and places, but we said we want to go to these legacy areas in order to help mobilize
And
those
necessarily revamp or re-envision the role of a biblical elder through the model and example, lest there be a vacuum.
Correct,
I
correct.
think
And that's why
the
we
big
started
deal.
the church as well. So we were in Malawi, and that led us to start a church for some of the same reasons.
And so being able to step into that leadership role, you can, Nathan, help shape the vision of not only what it looks like to be a healthy church leader, an elder, but also to shape the vision of what it looks like to be a healthy church. And if we're going to be a healthy church and we're going to flourish in the city that we're planted, well, that doesn't mean that we're trying to reach every person in that city to come to our church, which would be the default mode in our city. But rather realizing that, hey, if we plant all kinds of different churches around the city that are accessible to all kinds of different people, then that's going to be better for the gospel in the long end, in the end of the ministry. So we get to drive and shape the vision. We get to drive and shape some models so that we can say, hey, see what we're doing here and go do likewise.
And the vacuum issue, that illustration, I think also illustrates the importance of discipling the whole church. Because we've had situations like that in some of our stronger networks in South Asia, where people have entered a church, a new church, like a church plant, maybe a year-old believer, something like that. They come in, they start teaching something that's off, maybe not necessarily the prosperity gospel, but some kind of false teaching. And people in the church who are largely illiterate have been able to identify and kick out those leaders to be able to say, show me in the Word where that is, because that doesn't sound like the thing that we have been hearing from the Word of God and studying together. And so just that foundation, I think, is so critical. See, we're interrupting each other. It's like a debate.
I love it. Mac, I want to bring you in, brother.
Yes, I have
Anything we're
many
missing
things
here?
to say about this. One
Jump
of
on
which
in.
is you didn't follow the Democratic Baptist principle of having a second vote, because I would have voted on that one too. So I want to say, I don't care that much, honestly. I think it is. Well, I use the term case by case.
Wait. I'm sorry.
I
I'm not gonna
appreciate
let you
that,
have
Chris.
that.
You're
don't
interrupting.
care?
So I don't care which model you're following on that. I feel like it's case by case. I think it depends on the context situation. I use case by case. Chris uses a different term. Contextualization, kind of anyhow. But I do. But my preference, I preference the idea of pastoring and planting because it models what we want people to do. I don't know how to model being a good pastor, being a good elder, unless I'm doing it for other people. And so for all the emphasis that we've heard this morning already on imitating, which I utterly agree, I think it's the thing that we need to have in our mind, that I'm going to do this for a while and then I'm going to leave, which is what I did in Iraq. And I left a healthy church, a vibrant, Bible-drenched, gospel-driven church with solid elders in 4 years. I would have loved to have 5, actually. So I know Jesse says 3, but regardless, it's just because he's smarter than I am, and he's got a doctorate. And so, but does that make sense for me, that I lean that way? Because if we're going to be calling people to imitate, I think it's best for us to be members, bottom line, of a church, and then elders if the church asks us to be.
Go ahead. I think there's one issue that we're not addressing that needs to be addressed, and it's the issue of money. When the first context in which I served, in the country I served, my family was at the upper tier of the socioeconomic stratosphere. So if we were to try to be a planter pastor in that situation, the church would look at us and be like, there is no way we can support you financially. And when you leave and we want somebody to come in and be a pastor in your place, there's no way we could replicate you because we just can't afford it. And so we would intentionally hold back and try to empower the local believers and the local leaders so that it fit their context. But in the current city that I'm in now, I mean, my family is lower middle class. And, if the church wanted to pay our salary, there would be no problem for them. We don't ask for that. We don't get paid by our church, but we serve as a volunteer. But money does play into this role and or into our methods. It plays into our strategy, and yeah, we have to take that into.
What role would you say though that money might play even as a member of a church in that? In your formal context, because we had that in Sub-Saharan.
Right. I mean, they would definitely look to us as someone who is of means and want us to help finance things. We would have to be very discerning about how we would do it, because once we're gone, if they are dependent upon our funds and our giving, then they're not going to be able to do the ministry without us there. So it's part of that self-supporting, and so we don't want to limit their ability to do ministry in the future because they don't have access to our funds.
All right, last word on this one, and then we're going to go back to the audience.
Well, Dr. McKinley, it's interesting. One of the strongest statements in all of the IMB's Foundations document, page 57 or 59.
Which version?
Yeah. Of the most recent version, downloadable today, you'll recognize the IMB makes a statement that universal, and listen to this, universal missionary experience has demonstrated that dependence on outside leaders or funding is detrimental to the health, vitality, and reproducibility of the local church. I think in the heart of the cross-cultural task, the notion that an indigenous church, that all that's needed, all expectation of the groom for the bride would be owned locally, would be allowed, not in function but in form, to be contextual, to be indigenous. And there's times when even our presence, as Jesse's alluded to, certainly our finance, at times even our skill as we invest might usurp or stand in the way of what we hope is owned locally. And then cross-cultural workers, then, we're going to defer to passing the baton with as many laps as needed and as few as essential in order to see those locals stand up. 4 years in northern Iraq sounds perfectly appropriate to me.
All right, thank you very much. By the way, we've referred to Foundations. If you want a copy, the Bevan Center has a limited supply, but we'll certainly give you one of those if you like. Why did I let us go so long on this question? Well, because it's really, as you can tell, at the heart of our topic of this conference, and so I let that run quite long. But is there another question or two in the room? Here we go.
Hey, so if this has been addressed previously and I just didn't quite catch it, I would love to hear it again. But in the model of planting and avoiding pastoring, if possible, even with things like elder training cohorts and preaching teams, to cite a couple of y'all's examples, if it's not the missionary or church planter who's doing the pastoring during that period where men are being trained to pastor, who is eldering or pastoring the church, assuming that those men are not ready overnight?
It's great. Great question. I think it actually ties into Mac's comment that I wanted to respond to as well. I think it's important to note that Paul could consistently call even his elders, the elders in the Ephesian church, to imitate him, to follow his example. That could be the core of his leadership, while never self-identifying as an elder, but yet always practicing itinerant church planting. And so all that to say, you don't have to be an elder to model and set the example for what an elder would look like and what an elder would do. Because Paul was obviously preaching. Paul was obviously shepherding. Paul was obviously guarding. He was doing those things that an elder would do as a leader, and I would argue even as like a church planter. That's part of the job description, is that you're doing those things. And you're doing them in such a way that you could even say to new and prospective elders, hey, do what I did. I was preaching, teaching day and night in public from house to house. Do those things. So I think it is, you as the church planter, that is actually part of the job description, is that you could work in such a way that you could say to an emerging elder, hey, follow this pattern. The question also out there in the first journey, they go back, it says, and they appoint elders in all the churches. So what were those churches doing? What was the church in Pisidia and Antioch doing in the several months that it took Paul and Barnabas to go on to Iconium, to Lystra and Derbe? Not an appointed elder there. Who was shepherding that church? And so I think there's even a time that we could expect in the life of a church, when you're starting from the ground up, there's a life cycle of a church plant that legitimately comes from the harvest, where there may be a time when they don't have an elder. There may be a time that even the church planter is physically removed from them for a time. And that's why we focus so much on a foundation of, hey, everybody gets everything. Everybody has to be involved in this process. Everybody has to have access to the scriptures to know, and at least initially, how to understand it. And then the church planter coming in, checking, helping to guide, helping to shepherd, and then raising up and identifying, helping them to self-identify who are the people who are exhibiting the gifts and the skills, the calling to be the elder for our flock, and then helping them to affirm and appoint.
I think Paul would remain where he was at as long as he could. I mean, often Paul went from city to city because he was kicked out, run out, facing persecution. But when he was active in a city doing the work of an itinerant missionary, to use your term, he was all in that place. So he may not be called an elder or a pastor in that location, but he was active in that congregation. And so he knew the brothers and sisters there, and they knew him, so that he could say, follow me. They did see him. He wasn't somebody who just kind of parachuted in and parachuted out. He wasn't a non-residential missionary.
Just one comment. Paul self-identified as an apostle, big A apostle too. So he kind of pulls rank on that. So
That's right.
And to the Romans, to your point, Chris, he does prioritize his travel. He prioritizes his time investment. In Romans 15, I'm convinced that you Romans are competent to instruct one another. Therefore, I hope that you'll help me on my way to Spain. Now, he does, in fact, it wasn't a parachute, but in chains arrives, and in house arrest remains, but yet his priority, specifically having assessed, presumably through word of mouth, that the Romans had what was needed to rightly divide. Romans 6:17 had been entrusted to the pattern that was presented to them. He was able to prioritize and didn't prioritize time with them, but intended to slingshot beyond them so that he would not be building on someone else's foundation.
Yeah, assessing the Roman Church, though, let's face it, is a little bit difficult because we don't really have the history of its beginning, who planted it, etc. So I think that's a difficult one to deal with. We can surmise some things from Romans because he does say he longs to teach the gospel to them. However, it's apparent that they're quite aware of the gospel. It's a lot of the way Paul talks, right? You know the gospel, you love the gospel. I long to teach you the gospel. And I am, as you were sharing, Jesse, I was wondering, well, are we splitting hairs when we say, well, he didn't identify as an elder, but as Mac pointed out, he certainly did as an apostle, and as you said, he was fulfilling, at least in part, that role or demonstrating that role. So I think we can get to I don't believe you all are splitting hairs, but I think we can get pretty close to it if we're not careful. But I want to...
I mean, people doing the work of a pastor under a different title, that's not a big issue these days, right?
No, not at all. We'll be convening the next convention, and it's fun to be Southern Baptist. All right, do we have another question out there? Here we go, over here. Oh, sorry, please.
My question is on kind of this last aspect of the missionary cycle that we see, kind of this exit and to use your word, and trust. I was just wondering if y'all had any specific examples of a healthy exit. I know Matt kind of touched on his leaving Iraq, but just kind of those healthy aspects of exiting. And then from kind of scripture, we see Paul writing letters and then revisiting these churches on his second and third journey. So what does, I guess, the present day letters and revisiting journeys look like today?
I actually had a real baton passing. I don't know where they found a baton in Dubai, but they did. They don't run track in Dubai, but they bought a baton, and everyone got together. It was like 300 folks came together to say goodbye to us because I was handing the baton over to a gifted indigenous leader. 300 people showed up. Everyone said nice things about me. It was great. It was kind of like getting to go to your own funeral and not having to die. You know.
I think each component of the missionary task deserves examination with these same questions. Probably exit, as far as the components of the missionary task as put forward by the IMB, exit has less scholarship, maybe even runway as far as evaluation, examination. When and where do we move on from a village where we've been seed sowing or sharing the gospel? Would we consider that an aspect of exit? When and where would we release a disciple or no longer need to be the day-to-day with a disciple, with a church, with a set of leaders? Interestingly, when it comes to entry, when and where would we exit from a people group or from a mega city target? In each component, then, there's aspects of exit. And to your question, the question it brings as I listen and process what you asked, the question that might be for this group as well to wrestle with, that might just demonstrate the distinction and some of our nuance. Is there still an ongoing foundation-laying role, a la 1 Corinthians 3? I laid the foundation, someone else is building upon it. And if that foundation-laying role continues in a pioneer setting, how is it distinct from the ongoing role of shepherding that even if Paul's vacuum, even if Paul's departure seems to demand in places like Corinth, where as he left, others would build upon that foundation? Are the foundation-laying role and the shepherding role distinct? How do we see it? Without that, if no distinction, what would we be even referring to in a missionary task? Those questions come as I process exit.
All right, very good. There was another question here, I think, Jonathan.
Thank you. It's kind of estimated that across Christian traditions, there's about 5 million pastors or somebody in that role, and only 5% of them are going to get any access to formal Bible education of any level. And given the limitations of formal Bible education, given the limitations of in-person discipleship by mature believers, how do we bridge that gap? How much of this process can be done digitally, a digital epistle, so to speak, and how can Southern Baptists do better digitally to reach all these pastors that we may never reach in person?
Anybody want to touch the internet there?
Coy said he's writing on that so that Coy can answer it.
Right, so
yeah.
we're waiting on Coy's
Once Coy writes his
successful
dissertation,
completion of his seminars,
then we'll
his
know.
comprehensive, and then finally the answer to that question.
3 to 4 years. So I don't have a full answer to that question, but I will say that we do have partners on the field who, during COVID, were really pushed in the direction of online theological training. Partners who had been resistant to things like that COVID just pushed them online. And so the seminary that I teach in a couple of years ago, I taught an online course, and I had students in that class. I'm in Southeast Asia, okay? So all of Southeast Asia was represented in that class, as well as Japan. It's not that far away. Korea, South Africa, the Netherlands, 4 countries in South Asia. All these students in that classroom who were all being trained at a higher seminary level training, but they also had networks that they were training people in. So they were in our class getting their theological training so that they could go and train others in their networks. So I think the church has learned through the blessing of COVID that there are ways to push theological training out to the edges through the internet, but we still haven't figured out the best ways to do that. And there's a lot of different Christian ministries and leadership training cohorts that are trying to figure out how best to deliver that. And we have a lot of work to do in that area. But we're on the move.
I'd say once again, so back to our case by case, our contextual based answer is part of it, right? Because I think some of the times we think we have a digital solution that's going to work in every context. So we were in Africa when COVID hit, and a lot of the online solutions simply don't work in a low resource area. And when the power's off half the time, when the cell service is down, or when it's simply cost prohibitive for people to access those things. So I think we certainly have a lot of work to do in getting creative about how to not just solve that problem in theory, like how we could best design an online curriculum, but how we're actually going to deliver that to different contexts that vary greatly in terms of access.
I think it's important as well, though, to just recognize that if we do that, if we are looking at digital pathways, we have to acknowledge that we're only fulfilling a particular piece within leadership development. It's really only content at that point, because the local assessment, the modeling, the one anothering, all that's so important to that, that has to be a part of that as well. So I think that leads us toward thinking at the ground level that the leadership training that we do, the theological training that we do, it has to carry an undercurrent of being able to be passed on. It has to have that thinking even from the very beginning that whatever I'm receiving in a 2 Timothy 2:2 way, I have to be able to pass it on to somebody else. Not all of it. Not everything that we ever train somebody has to be reproducible. But there has to be that undercurrent to know that even in the absence of internet, in the absence of access to content, if I have the Bible and the people of God and the Spirit of God, then we can move forward the gospel of God. And so just to always have that in our mind as we're thinking through all the ways that we teach and we train and develop leaders.
All right, let's take time for one more question. Here we go.
Oh. Rock, paper, scissors.
Okay, well, my interns say this is first, and I believe my interns.
Hi, brothers. I had a question regarding teaching complementarianism overseas. What did it look like in your context to teach people to have a biblical view of women in the church, especially because I know that certain cultures might be totally okay with women preaching while others might not value women in the same way. So how did you navigate that?
So in our context, I'll just say specifically in Malawi, Southeastern Africa, there was a historical devaluing of females across the culture, and there was a rightful correction to that was happening in tertiary, or rather primary, secondary, and tertiary education that was happening across the board, and that was a positive thing. So there were NGOs and other people that were coming in and encouraging children, particularly female children, to stay in school through the process, and so all of that was positive. And then what was happening was any teaching on complementarianism that was coming along was then reinterpreted through that lens of, okay, this is just people trying to keep women and girls in their place again. And so for us, that was a challenge. I don't know if I have the solution to it, but that was a challenge that we were facing, is how to communicate biblical complementarianism in a context where it was going to be interpreted as, somebody mentioned colonialism earlier, it was going to be mentioned as colonialistic, paternalistic, and all of the other things, or just a reinforcement of a negative aspect of the culture that existed.
Now, I'll just say I haven't, in my experience, encountered the culture where the Scripture, even the New Testament, wasn't intensely empowering for women in the mission and the ministry. We often major in the certain areas, rightly understood these days, to the point that even earlier, distinguishing the fellow worker, the co-laborer, the synergos, the co-worker, fellow soldier that Paul seems to reference. Again, 38 of those names associated with Paul, synergos, that reference to carrying on the work just as Paul was. Andreas Kostenberger, now at Midwestern Seminary, Paul, or Women in the Pauline Mission, is going to acknowledge 18% of those names, roughly 1 out of 5, referenced as co-workers are the Tryphena and Tryphosas and Euodia and Sicthenes of the New Testament. Well, in my mind and heart, then we do need to distinguish that co-worker, that aspect of mission, as distinct from 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Timothy 3, reserved for elders, recognizing their complementarianism. And in the meantime, the Scripture of God is unleashing, it's empowering, even in the examples of what ladies across the New Testament involved in ministry in intimate and personal ways that are indispensable.
Yeah, I agree with both these brothers. In a Muslim context, it wasn't very hard to emphasize complementarianism. You know, you can go above the line or below the line on biblical truth. And so liberalism goes below the line, flattens everything out. But in a Muslim context, you go above the line, you don't let women do anything. And so it was important, like the brothers are saying, to make sure that we understood that the women need to be taught well, and taught with the purpose that they're going to fulfill Titus 2:2, teach the other women. So it was easy for us. I think it's much harder in the West to do that. So.
Can I say one more thing about that as well? In another
One, two, short, and then...
In another context we had where we had rightfully had female seminary students, and this goes to like the way cultures process information and think about things in a very concrete, holistic setting. The conclusion was, well, if females can be students, then why can't they be pastors? And it's a very Western kind of thing to dichotomize the difference between a student at a seminary not necessarily becoming a pastor. At least in our context, it was. And so that was verbally expressed to me was, well, why do we have female students if they can't be pastors? And so that was another challenge in terms of just the way different cultures process things.
All right, Jesse.
My wife wrote a book on this. I'll just say that. I'll put it out there because we have to end. My wife wrote a book. It's called The Co-Workers Study. Goes through all the examples of women, the ways that they were used in the New Testament and the Old Testament by God.
Where can we find this book?
I think if you search online, you can get it. Amazon? No, it's not for sale. It's just a free ebook. It's online.
The title one more time.
Co-Workers. There's a podcast too.
Is there anything after the colon? I mean, if I just look co-workers, I'll get it.
The Co-Workers Podcast. Go there, you can find it.
There you go.